On the night of November 13, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal churned black as ink beneath a moonless sky. Japanese Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded his formidable task force with the confidence of a predator who owned the darkness. For nearly a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the Pacific night like phantom kings, their sailors' eyes adapted to starlight, their tactics honed through countless nocturnal engagements. American ships that dared venture into these waters after sunset had learned a brutal lesson. The rising sun's warriors could see what others could not, strike where others fumbled blind, and vanish before dawn revealed their positions. The Japanese called it yasen, night battle doctrine, and it had become their most devastating weapon. Abe's confidence was not misplaced. His crews had trained relentlessly in night operations, practicing formations in complete darkness until they moved as one organism through the black void. Japanese optical equipment, their binoculars and rangefinders, represented the finest craftsmanship in the world, ground and polished to perfection in workshops where artisans spent lifetimes mastering their trade. Their gunners could acquire targets by starlig, HT alone. Their torpedomen could calculate firing solutions while American sailors still groped for landmarks. In engagement after engagement, at Savo Island, Cape Esperance, Tassafaronga, Japanese destroyers and cruisers had torn through Allied formations like wolves among sheep. The Americans had paid for their nighttime inadequacies in blood and steel. Thousands of sailors rested in their iron tombs at the bottom of what Marines grimly dubbed Iron Bottom Sound. The United States Navy possessed superior industrial capacity, more ships, more resources. But none of that mattered when you couldn't see your enemy until his torpedoes were already cleaving through your hull. American commanders dreaded the sunset, knowing that darkness transformed their numerical advantage into a death sentence. Something had to change, or the Pacific War would become an endless procession of daylight stalemates and nocturnal slaughters. But on this particular November night, something was different. Among the American ships scrambling to intercept Abe's bombardment force, new vessels were taking their positions, destroyers of a revolutionary class that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, fresh from American shipyards, carried a secret weapon that Japanese intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. Mounted behind unassuming panels on their bridges sat devices that could pierce the darkness more effectively than 1,000 trained eyes. Radar systems that painted electronic pictures of the battlefield, revealing every ship, every landmass, every movement within dozens of miles. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, published between 1947 and 1962, the introduction of shipboard radar represented the single most decisive technological advantage the United States would leverage against Japanese night-fighting supremacy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter Japan's nocturnal invincibility forever, though Abe and his confident warriors couldn't yet imagine that their century of darkness mastery was about to end in a few catastrophic minutes of electronic warfare. The story of how America's Fletcher-Class destroyers came to possess their radar advantage began not in the Pacific, but in laboratories and drawing rooms thousands of miles from any battlefield. Throughout 1940 and 1941, while Japanese opticians perfected their binoculars by fractions of millimeters, American scientists and engineers pursued a fundamentally different approach to solving the night-fighting problem. Instead of enhancing human vision, they decided to replace it entirely with electronic eyes that never tired, never blinked, and could see through conditions that rendered human perception useless. The SC and SG radar systems installed on Fletcher-Class destroyers represented years of rapid innovation compressed into crash development programs. The SC air search radar, mounted on a distinctive bedspring-shaped antenna atop the ship's masts, could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles. The SG surface search radar, with its rotating dish antenna, could paint a picture of surface vessels and coastlines with unprecedented clarity. These weren't the crude, experimental sets that had appeared on earlier American ships. These were refined, reliable systems that worked consistently even in the hands of hastily trained operators. Engineering the technology was only half the battle. The Fletcher-Class destroyers themselves represented a marvel of design optimization, purpose-built to incorporate these electronic marvels while maintaining the speed, firepower, and seakeeping abilities necessary for Pacific combat. Stretching 376 feet from bow to stern and displacing over 2,000 tons at full load, these ships were larger than their Japanese counterparts, but paradoxically more maneuverable. Their power plants, twin boilers feeding twin turbines, could drive them to nearly 37 knots, making them among the fastest destroyers afloat. The United States Navy commissioned USS Fletcher herself, the lead ship of the class, on June 30th, 1942. She was merely the first of what would become the most numerous class of destroyers ever built by any nation. 175 vessels eventually joined the fleet, pouring from American shipyards at a pace that bewildered Japanese intelligence analysts. How could a nation produce such sophisticated warships so quickly? The answer lay in American industrial methods: standardization, prefabrication, and the application of assembly line techniques to shipbuilding. Components were manufactured in factories across the country and assembled at the yards, allowing multiple ships to be built simultaneously. But quantity without quality would have meant little. Each Fletcher-class destroyer received meticulous attention during fitting out, ensuring her radar systems were properly calibrated and her crews adequately trained in their use. The Navy established special schools where operators learned to interpret the green glow of radar scopes, distinguishing real contacts from sea return, rain squalls, and electronic ghosts. These men became a new breed of sailor, radar operators whose eyes never left their scopes during action, calling out ranges and bearings while their shipmates fought blind in the darkness beyond the bridge windows. The Japanese, meanwhile, continued to invest their faith in optical perfection and human training. Their intelligence services knew the Americans possessed radar, captured documents and prisoner interrogations confirmed it, but they fundamentally misunderstood its capabilities and significance. Japanese doctrine dismissed radar as a supplement to, not a replacement for, trained human observers. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic because they were preparing to fight the previous war while their enemies had already moved into the next one. By early November 1942, the strategic situation around Guadalcanal had reached a critical juncture. American Marines clung to Henderson Field, the island's airstrip, while Japanese forces controlled most of the surrounding jungle. Both sides recognized that whoever controlled that airstrip would ultimately control the island, and whoever controlled Guadalcanal would determine the war's trajectory in the South Pacific. The Japanese High Command decided to break the stalemate with a massive naval bombardment that would obliterate Henderson Field and its aircraft, paving the way for troop reinforcements and eventual American expulsion. Admiral Abe received his orders on November 10th. Take a powerful task force down the slot, the waters between the Solomon Islands chains, and shell Henderson Field into rubble during the night of November 13th. His force was formidable. The battleships Hiei and Kirishima, whose 14-inch guns could demolish the airfield, the light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers. The battleships carried special bombardment ammunition, thin-walled shells designed to burst on impact and spread destruction across wide areas. Abe's confidence was absolute. No American surface force could challenge such power in darkness, where Japanese superiority was unquestionable. American intelligence, reading Japanese communications through the top-secret magic decryption program, detected the threat. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, recently arrived in the theater, gathered what forces he could muster: 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, including several Fletcher-class vessels equipped with the new radar systems. His ships were outnumbered and outgunned, facing battleships with his cruisers and destroyers. Under normal circumstances, such an engagement in darkness would be suicide. But Callahan possessed an advantage that Abe couldn't see or anticipate: electronic vision that turned darkness from enemy to ally. The two fleets converged on parallel courses through the night of November 12th into the early hours of November 13th. Aboard the Japanese vessels, lookouts strained their eyes against the darkness, binoculars raised, searching for any sign of American ships. Their optical equipment was superb, their training impeccable. but they were looking for visual targets in conditions where the human eye, no matter how well trained, remained fundamentally limited. The darkness was complete, clouds obscuring even the stars that Japanese navigators typically used for orientation. Aboard the American destroyers, a different scene unfolded. Radar operators watched their scopes intently as glowing pips materialized in the electronic darkness, each one representing a Japanese vessel. The SG surface search radars painted a comprehensive picture of Abe's entire formation: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all revealed in their precise positions, courses, and speed. Fire control solutions were calculated before Japanese lookouts had even detected American ships. Gunnery officers received continuous updates on target positions, ranges decreasing minute by minute. The Americans were blind in the visual spectrum, but they could see everything that mattered. The tactical advantage was revolutionary. While Japanese commanders relied on visual sighting reports that came too late for proper maneuvering, American commanders watched the entire battle develop on their radar scopes. They could anticipate Japanese movements, position their ship's foe, our optimal firing solutions, and coordinate actions across the task force with unprecedented precision. The night that was supposed to be Japan's greatest ally had been transformed into their most treacherous enemy through the magic of electronics and electromagnetic waves that painted pictures invisible to human eyes. At precisely 1:48 a.m. on November 13, 1942, the two fleets collided in what would become known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The engagement occurred at range, so close that larger guns couldn't depress enough to hit targets, a savage point-blank brawl that devolved into chaos within minutes. But those first few minutes, before confusion overwhelmed both sides, demonstrated the revolutionary nature of radar-directed naval combat in a way that no peacetime exercise could have predicted. The American destroyer USS O'Bannon, a Fletcher-Class vessel, acquired the Japanese battleship Hiei on her SG radar at a range of approximately 27,000 yards, over 13 miles. Her fire control radar locked onto the massive target, feeding continuous solution updates to her gun directors. When O'Bannon's 5-inch guns opened fire, their shells were already traveling toward where Hiei would be, not where she appeared to be. The Japanese battleship, meanwhile, had not yet detected any American ships visually. Her lookout still scanned empty darkness, while shells were already arcing through the night toward her superstructure. USS Fletcher herself, operating as part of the American destroyer screen, demonstrated the full potential of radar-directed gunnery. Her operators tracked multiple Japanese destroyers simultaneously, prioritizing targets and feeding solutions to her weapon systems. Her skipper maneuvered, not on visual sightings but on the electronic picture developing on his radar scope, positioning his ship to unmask all gun mounts while maintaining optimal range from torpedo threats. Japanese destroyers, suddenly illuminated by American searchlights and under accurate fire from invisible enemies, broke formation in confusion. Their vaunted night-fighting training assumed they would detect threats before being detected. Radar had inverted that fundamental assumption. The battle quickly deteriorated into a melee where radar advantage became less decisive. Ships were so close that visual targeting was unavoidable, and in the confusion, American and Japanese vessels maneuvered blindly among each other, firing at anything that appeared in the darkness. Admiral Al-Callahan died when his flagship was destroyed. Japanese and American ships collided or passed so close their crews could have thrown objects across the gaps. The engagement became a savage brawl where training, courage, and luck mattered more than technology. But when dawn broke and both fleets withdrew to assess damage, the strategic results revealed radar's true impact. The battleship Hiei, pounded by radar-directed fire during those opening minutes, had sustained critical damage. Her steering was wrecked. Fires raged through her superstructure, and she could barely maneuver. As daylight strengthened, American aircraft from Henderson Field, the very airfield Abe had been sent to destroy, swarmed over the crippled giant. Throughout November 13th, wave after wave of American planes bombed and torpedoed Hiei until she finally capsized and sank that evening, the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. The Japanese had failed in their primary mission. Henderson Field remained operational, its aircraft intact and deadly. Abe's bombardment force had been turned back by what should have been an inferior American force. The night that was supposed to belong to Japan had been contested and ultimate, lie denied. Japanese naval officers analyzing the engagement struggled to understand what had happened. Their ships had been detected first, engaged first, and hit first, all while operating in the darkness that was supposed to guarantee their superiority. Something fundamental had changed in naval warfare, though the full implications wouldn't become clear until subsequent engagements confirmed the pattern. Over the following weeks and months of 1942 and into 1943, the pattern established at Guadalcanal repeated itself with devastating consistency. Japanese forces continued to engage American ships in nighttime actions, and Japanese forces continued to be detected first, targeted first, and mauled by enemies who seemed to possess supernatural vision. Each engagement added more evidence that the Americans had developed a capability that negated centuries of Japanese naval tradition and tactical doctrine. The naval battle of Guadalcanal continued through November 13th and 14th, with additional engagements. Japanese forces made another attempt to bombard Henderson Field, this time succeeding partially, but at catastrophic cost. American radar-equipped ships detected the incoming Japanese formations and positioned themselves for ambush. The battleship Kirishima, trying to complete the mission her sister ship Hiei had failed, found herself engaged by the American battleship USS Washington, whose fire control radar had tracked her through complete darkness. Washington's 9 16-inch guns, directed by radar with mechanical precision, pounded Kirishima at ranges where Japanese optical equipment struggled to even locate their tormentor. Kirishima absorbed dozens of heavy shells and sank before dawn, the second Japanese battleship lost in 3 days. Japanese naval intelligence began collecting reports from survivors and analyzing the tactical patterns. Officers who had participated in these night actions reported disturbing consistency. American ships seemed to know Japanese positions before visual detection was possible. American gunfire achieved accuracy in complete darkness that should have been impossible without illumination. American formations maneuvered with coordination that required each ship to know every other ship's position, information that darkness should have concealed. The pieces pointed toward a technology that Japanese doctrine had dismissed as supplementary, suddenly proving decisive. The Japanese Navy possessed radar technology themselves. They had developed several models for use on ships and aircraft. But their sets were less sophisticated than American systems. Their integration into fire control was incomplete, and their doctrine had never prioritized radar over human observation. Japanese naval training emphasized the warrior spirit, physical conditioning, adaptation exercises, and trust in superior optical equipment. These were human qualities, martial virtues that aligned with cultural values about dedication and fighting spirit. To admit that American electronics could render these virtues obsolete was to challenge fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. Yet the evidence became undeniable. In battle after battle, Kolombangara, Vela Gulf, Empress Augusta Bay, American destroyers detected Japanese forces first, maneuvered into advantageous positions while Japanese ships searched visually and delivered devastating attacks before Japanese commanders understood what was happening. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, now arriving in increasing numbers, proved particularly lethal. Their radar systems were reliable, their crews were well trained in their use, and their doctrine fully integrated electronics into tactical decision-making. These ships represented a new type of naval warfare, where information dominance through technology trumped traditional seamanship and fighting spirit. Japanese attempts to counter the radar advantage proved inadequate. Some ships installed additional optical equipment, as if better binoculars could compete with electromagnetic radiation. Others emphasized even more rigorous night training, drilling crews to the point of exhaustion in hopes of squeezing marginal improvements from human physiology. A few forward-thinking officers advocated for crash programs to develop radar systems matching American capabilities, but these efforts came too late and received insufficient resources. Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched beyond sustainability, unable to match American production in ships, aircraft, or electronics. The technological gap widened rather than closed. The introduction of radar to naval warfare represented more than just a new gadget mounted on ships. It fundamentally transformed tactical thinking and operational doctrine. American naval commanders, initially cautious about trusting electronics over traditional navigation and gunnery methods, gradually recognized that radar wasn't replacing human judgment, but vastly enhancing it. By 1943, American tactical publications were being rewritten to incorporate radar capabilities as primary rather than auxiliary systems, and the Navy's approach to nighttime operations transformed completely. Fletcher-Class destroyers became the testbed for radar-centric tactics. Their commanders learned to fight from the radar scope rather than the bridge wing, maintaining dark adaptation for emergencies, but making decisions based on electronic information. Fire control procedures evolved to integrate radar ranging directly into gunnery calculations, bypassing the optical rangefinders that had been standard equipment since the dreadnought era. Ships began coordinating movements based on shared radar pictures, with formation leaders broadcasting contact information over voice radio, allowing entire task forces to respond to threats before visual detection occurred. The tactical advantages multiplied beyond simple detection. Radar allowed American ships to navigate with precision through dangerous waters at night, threading between islands, avoiding reefs, maintaining formation in complete darkness, with confidence that would have been suicidal before. Japanese forces trying to supply their garrisons under cover of darkness found American destroyers waiting in ambush at positions that should have been secret. The Tokyo Express runs, fast destroyer convoys the Japanese used to resupply troops without exposing slower transports to daylight air attack, became shooting galleries where American radar-equipped ships positioned themselves along predictable routes and opened fire at ranges where Japanese lookouts still saw only darkness. Fire control integration reached remarkable sophistication. By mid-1943, Fletcher-Class destroyers could engage multiple targets simultaneously, their radar systems tracking several contacts while fire control computers calculated separate solutions for each one. Gun directors received continuous position updates, automatically adjusting aim points to account for target movement, ship movement, wind, and other variables. Human gunners became system supervisors rather than active aimers, monitoring equipment that could track and engage targets with superhuman precision. Japanese ships, still relying on optical tracking and manual calculations, found themselves hopelessly outmatched in the speed and accuracy of engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces became significant. Sailors who had once approached night operations with confidence now faced darkness with dread. The Americans had somehow seized the advantage that Japanese doctrine considered fundamental to their superiority. Stories circulated among Japanese crews about ghost ships that appeared from nowhere, firing with impossible accuracy, then vanishing before countermeasures could be organized. Morale suffered as sailors recognized they were fighting an enemy who could see them while remaining invisible. An enemy who had turned night itself into a weapon against those who had once mastered it. American industrial capacity meant that radar advantages accelerated over time. By 1944, virtually every American surface combatant carried multiple radar systems: search radars, fire control radars, navigation radars, integrated into comprehensive electronic suites that provided commanders with detailed situational awareness, regardless of visibility conditions. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, struggled to install even basic radar sets on NI ships, and those systems they did field remained inferior in range, resolution, and reliability. The technological gap that had appeared in late 1942 had widened into a chasm that Japanese industry couldn't bridge while simultaneously fighting a losing war across the Pacific. The loss of night fighting superiority carried strategic consequences far beyond individual tactical defeats. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the assumption that American forces could be defeated in decisive surface actions where superior training and night fighting capabilities would offset American material advantages. When radar eliminated Japanese nocturnal supremacy, the entire strategic calculus shifted catastrophically. American forces could now operate around the clock, maintaining pressure on Japanese positions continuously rather than withdrawing at sunset and ceding the darkness to enemy operations. The Central Pacific Offensive that began in late 1943 and continued through 1944 demonstrated the strategic fruits of radar-enabled naval superiority. American amphibious operations against Japanese-held islands proceeded with continuous naval gunfire support day and night. Fletcher-Class destroyers positioned themselves off landing beaches and maintained fire missions through darkness, their radar systems, providing navigation precision and target tracking that kept guns firing accurately when visual observation was impossible. Japanese forces attempting to interfere with these operations found themselves engaged by ships they couldn't see. Their attempts at nighttime torpedo attacks detected and countered before torpedoes reached their targets. The Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf campaigns in 1944 showcased American naval dominance built substantially on radar foundation. At Philippine Sea, American carriers detected incoming Japanese aircraft formations at extreme ranges, allowing fighter direction officers to vector interceptors toward threats, while attackers were still dozens of miles away. At Leyte Gulf, American destroyers engaged Japanese surface forces during night actions, with a confidence that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The battle off Samar, where American escort carriers and destroyers faced Japanese battleships, saw Fletcher-Class destroyers making torpedo runs guided by radar, even as Japanese optical equipment struggled in rain and smoke. Japanese strategic responses to their technological disadvantage proved inadequate. Some planners advocated avoiding night actions entirely, ceding that domain to American forces and focusing on daylight operations where Japanese optical equipment still offered some advantages. Others pushed for kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks that bypassed conventional naval combat entirely and targeted American ships directly with explosive-laden aircraft. These desperate measures reflected the recognition that conventional naval warfare had turned decisively against Japan, and that technological inferiority in critical domains like radar had made traditional fleet actions unwinnable. The submarine war illustrated another strategic dimension of American radar superiority. United States submarines, equipped with search radars and periscope-mounted surface search systems, could detect Japanese convoys at night and attack with impunity. Japanese anti-submarine escorts lacking comparable radar systems struggled to detect surface submarines until visual range, by which time torpedoes were often already in the water. The steady attrition of Japanese merchant shipping, which strangled the island nation's war economy, accelerated substantially once American submarines began operating with radar-enabled night attacks. Fletcher-Class destroyers serving in submarine screening roles could detect and track submarine contacts with their sonar and radar combinations, making Japanese submarine operations increasingly hazardous. By 1945, American naval dominance was absolute. The Japanese combined fleet, once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in anchorages and unable to challenge American operations. The radar advantage, combined with overwhelming material superiority and tactical innovations it enabled, had transformed the Pacific Naval War from a contested struggle into an exhibition of technological superiority. Japanese naval officers who had once trained rigorously for night engagements found themselves commanding ships that rarely ventured from port, their skills irrelevant in a conflict where the enemy could see everything and strike from beyond visual range. The story of how American radar technology destroyed Japanese night-fighting supremacy became required study at naval academies and war colleges worldwide in the decades following World War II. The fundamental lesson transcended the specific technologies involved. It demonstrated that warfare's character could shift decisively and rapidly when new capabilities challenged existing doctrines. The Japanese Navy had been correct that night. Fighting was crucial to Pacific naval operations. They had been tragically wrong in assuming that human training and optical equipment would remain the decisive factors in nocturnal combat. The Fletcher-Class destroyers themselves became legendary in American naval history. 175 ships of the class were commissioned between 1942 and 1945, and they participated in virtually every major Pacific operation from Guadalcanal through the Japanese surrender. 19 were lost to enemy action, a remarkably low percentage given their intensive employment in combat. The survivors served for decades after the war's end, many being transferred to Allied navies where they continued operations into the 1970s and beyond. Some were converted into specialized roles, radar pickets, escort destroyers, experimental test beds, proving the basic design's versatility. The Japanese naval officers who survived the war and later wrote memoirs consistently identified American radar as one of the critical advantages that defeated them. Admiral Tamechi Hara, who commanded destroyers throughout the war and survived when most of his peers died, wrote extensively about the psychological impact of fighting an enemy who possessed what seemed like supernatural vision. He described the helplessness of commanding ships whose lookouts saw nothing while shells arrived with deadly accuracy from invisible enemies. Other veterans confirmed that by war's end, Japanese sailors understood they were fighting with World War I tools against enemies deploying capabilities that seemed to belong to future decades. American naval development built on the radar foundation established during World War II. Post-war destroyers incorporated increasingly sophisticated electronics, improved radars, early computers for fire control, data links that shared information between ships automatically. The guided missile revolution of the 1950s and 60s would have been impossible without the radar fire. Control experience gained on Fletcher-Class destroyers. Modern naval warfare, dominated by sensors and electronics, traces its lineage directly back to those first crude radar sets that painted glowing pictures on oscilloscope screens in darkened combat information centers. The broader lesson about technological surprise echoed through subsequent conflicts. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet naval forces invested heavily in electronics, sensors, and information systems, each side terrified of experiencing what Japan had suffered, a sudden decisive technological disadvantage that inverted assumed superiorities. The Gulf War of 1991 featured similar patterns, with coalition forces using electronic systems to detect, track, and engage Iraqi forces that operated with inferior sensors and situational awareness. The principle remained constant. In modern warfare, whoever sees first, shoots first, and usually wins. Today, Fletcher-Class destroyer USS Kidd sits as a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, preserved in her 1945 configuration with period radar systems still mounted on her mast and superstructure. Visitors can tour her combat information center and see the SG radar scope where operators once tracked Japanese ships through the darkness. The equipment, she looks primitive by contemporary standards. Vacuum tubes, analog displays, mechanical controls. But it represented revolution when new. Those crude systems accomplished what seemed impossible. They took night away from warriors who had owned darkness and gave it to a nation that had learned to master electronics. The Pacific night battles of 1942 through 1945 demonstrated a truth that subsequent wars would confirm repeatedly. In technological warfare, yesterday's decisive advantage becomes tomorrow's inadequacy with shocking speed. The Japanese Navy spent decades perfecting night fighting capabilities that became obsolete within months once radar reached operational maturity. The Fletcher-Class destroyers and their electronic eyes didn't just win battles. They rewrote the fundamental rules governing how battles would be fought, transforming naval warfare from an art dependent on human senses into a science dominated by electronics and electromagnetic spectrum mastery. In those dark Pacific waters, where Japanese lookouts strained their eyes against moonless nights while American radar operators watched glowing screens, the future of warfare was being written in phosphorescent green light.